Hello everyone, this is Days, and welcome to episode 3 of Brainwashing in Video Games. As promised in the previous episode, we will be taking a look at The Last of Us 1. But before we get into that, a little bit of a historical context.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad.
Operation Mockingbird is a large-scale program of the United States CIA that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. Part of what was revealed about Operation Mockingbird was that when controlling the media, they are not interested in commercial viability, as the money comes to them institutionally through taxes, but only interested in the psychological operational application of the produced media, which means that they're only interested in that 5 to 10% emotionally unstable demographic or psychographic that would be susceptible to conditioning through imagery, be it TV or social media or any form of mass media. These are people that would watch Tom and Jerry and would emulate hitting someone over the head with a hammer. People with hostile imaginations instead of heroic imaginations, as Dr. Philip Zimbardo would say. While the people that aren't like this and are not susceptible to imagery are of no interest to the psychological operation officer and are not part of the intended outreach. So when you hear a content creator or a company that should be trying to sell as much product as possible, telling you not to buy their stuff because it's not for you, they're saying that because their payment is guaranteed anyways by institutional investors. And they're trying to create an echo chamber for that 5 to 10% target audience they have in mind, and have their narrative be uncontested and unopposed while they influence and shape the emotionally vulnerable few. Having said that, let's get into the topic of the day, which is the hostile or mean world syndrome, which is defined as the cognitive bias where people perceive the world to be more dangerous than it actually is due to long-term, moderate to heavy exposure to violence-related content on mass media. As an editor myself who got training in a production company that produces TV shows, I can assure you that almost everything that you see in mass media goes through multiple executives before dissemination, and is carefully constructed, reviewed, and audited to invoke certain feelings and behaviors through the audio-visual representations. In psychology, this is called narrative transportation, which refers to the concept where a person is placed into and immersed in a world of a story or narrative. This term also implies that once a person is lost in the story, so to speak, then not only do their attitudes reflect that story, but their intentions may do so as well. Essentially, mass media used for psyops can be used to create a general impression about how people are in a life or death situation based on an artificial environment that a writer with a
secret agenda
puts you through in order to influence your perceptions and attitude towards humanity without developing direct experience on the subject. Think of it this way. Imagine how a racist father would bring up his child to hate minorities before they even get the chance to meet one for themselves and form their own opinion through direct experience. Think of how this kid would react to meeting a minority kid for the very first time, and how it would color that precious first interaction just because of the general impression given to him by his father. What is happening with The Last of Us and other misanthropic media is that it's teaching you to be prejudiced towards humanity before you even get the chance to see for yourself how honorable most people are in times of crisis. So these scenarios presented to us in The Last of Us 1 would only make sense in a world of shit where Druckmann can justify everyone being somehow immoral, because they're all victims of this thing that happened all by itself. It's never touched up on why there are different factions given that there is a clear and present worldwide common threat.
Just think how easy if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings here on this earth together.
It could be explained, for example, that the reason there are curfews and a tyrannical structure around the urban areas, working specifically against the Fireflies, is because the government is trying to hide that it released the mutated cordyceps virus as a form of population control, thus explaining the concept completely. But that would mean that Druckmann would have to talk about population control secretly initiated by the government. Instead, we're treated to this ambiguous war, with the underlying general impression being that people are inherently dangerous and irrationally murderous. And through the game mechanics, it feels as if the people themselves are more dangerous and bloodthirsty than the brain-devouring zombies. Which is bullshit, by the way. Time and time again, people have helped each other with no strings attached, when no lines of communication are present between the government and the people, as in the people did this all by themselves. No awareness campaigns, no NGOs, no government intervention, no corporate virtue signaling, and no incentive other than doing something good for someone else. You might say that, well, tribes have been at war with each other hundreds of years ago, where no government intervention was present. I would simply say to that, I'm here to observe and survey our current relevant world, where almost every land on Earth is under some form of government control, and not some era that had already passed and is no longer observable. It's a very misanthropic, short-sighted, and irrationally schizoid worldview that is presented in this, with all the variables of humanity being controlled so that no good outcome can result from your actions. And of course, that's just because that's what Druckmann wanted, and not because of any honest interpretation of the human condition. In a sense, it can be said that this is a maliciously deliberate misinterpretation of the human condition. Neil Druckmann is a very good writer. It's just that the agenda is malicious. And I'm saying that because it makes your writing way less satisfactory than it could have been. This is a general message to writers, that if you want to put in this moral relativism nonsense, the archetypal appeal of your story will suffer greatly, and it will become something closer to a Frankfurt School cultural Marxist-themed soap opera. And there is proof out there that you don't even need to be a seasoned professional in order to write a really good story, as exemplified in Undertale. All you have to do is be a good person and write your story with that spirit, and it will elevate your story to unprecedented heights. Not to mention that, for the past 50 years, it is the most controversial thing to take the moral high ground unapologetically. But Days, why are you so hung up over this? It's just a game. Unfortunately, that argument is flawed beyond imagination. It's just a book. It's just a movie. It's just a song. You wouldn't be saying that if you were listening to the first half of the video, especially after realizing that all of these mediums of entertainment are derived from real human experiences and do have an effect on the perceptions of the consumer population. Even ancient mythologies and legends are derived and inspired by the real world first, and then illustrated into archetypal stories in order to deliver a message or lesson. As Robert McKee once said, when we want mood experiences, we go to concerts or museums. When we want meaningful emotional experiences, we go to the storyteller. And games are indeed capable of telling compelling and meaningful stories in which people can derive some kind of moral value from, just like any other medium of entertainment. Who's to say that only movies or books can make us feel or understand?
Wait.
Welcome home, John.
Now, something I do appreciate about the connection that Druckmann drew between Joel and Ellie throughout the game, with Joel and Ellie unofficially accepting each other as father and daughter, is the locations in which you play in and the layout of the structure of the levels. You go to school, then to prom. Then he teaches her how to shoot a rifle. Then she has a teen tantrum, why won't you love me daddy kind of thing. Then he takes her to university. I think it was a smart way of structuring the levels of the story to kind of indirectly suggest that these two characters still got to experience the different stages people went through when life was normal, albeit in an apocalyptic setting. But it certainly solidifies the relationship between Joel and Ellie as father and daughter figures. And that was one of the reasons why people got attached to these two characters.
No,
Screw it.
easy. Holy shit. Are we gonna help him?
Put your seatbelt on, Ellie.
Well, what about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
Gangs wouldn't do this. This is not a natural occurrence. Most criminals who do this sort of stuff in third world countries like in South America, for example, are already working with the government. Current day criminals or gangs that you might use as a comparison can only exist and operate comfortably because of the government. From pirates working for the crown in the Caribbean to the most recent example of El Chapo confessing to collusion with top officials and politicians. Without the government, they couldn't exist. They'd have no more of their artificial power. And in a world like The Last of Us, people wouldn't turn on each other because that is not one of our instincts. Without the government, the people would be free to build a utopia. There would be better education, no crime, and a genuinely better life. Given that the bad actors in governments don't simply hire mercenaries to act as bandits and terrorize people to the point of unlivable conditions where they would be forced to ask for a government like what the Romans did to surrounding cultures. Without the government helping criminals, there's no incentive for these people to exist anymore. Because it's not in our nature to engage in such activities, especially selfish people who wouldn't put themselves in harm's way if they could benefit personally from building a cohesive society around them. So if you leave people alone, without pressure or intervention, to farm freely, raise their children, teach them, and take care of their health at home, everything will be fine. And people will take care of each other too. The only problem is this misanthropic worldview held by the government, its branches, through military and corporations, etc., and the mindless hordes that defend the existence and necessity of a government. And don't mistake this and assume that I'm saying I'm against rule of law. Of course, we all want some kind of law that keeps strangers at bay in order to preserve our precious liberty, privacy, and safety. As Frederick Bastiat wrote in his 1850 book, The Law, life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made law. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. And do not mistake the law for what is implied by the current governments, who tell you to give up on your privacy and freedom for safety, because you will get neither. Free men do not ask for freedom. They are born free and will die as free. As the 18th century French philosopher Charles Louis, also known as Montesquieu, wrote, "When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. In the long run, it is actually less lucrative to be evil." Evil in movies and media is often presented as the easier option, but it's actually a lot harder to maintain. Just think of the defunct gang situation in Pittsburgh. It's a lot harder for this gang to be at odds with everyone. They have to maintain their perimeter. They can't even trust their own members because their actions have made them so universally distrusted. They have to make sure that all outsiders are killed. They have to maintain their weapon stocks because their power depends on brute force. Now, how much easier had it been if this was just a group of people that allowed outsiders to pass through, even if they had to be escorted out at gunpoint? How much easier would it be if they allowed for free trade with other humans? The only way that criminal organizations manage to work in today's society is because low-level gangs are often backed up by someone a lot bigger and higher up on the food chain. That is the only way evil can survive on the lower levels, by being enforced and promoted from higher, more consolidated groups. In a post-apocalyptic world, such superstructures can't exist anymore.
Okay.
See? What'd I tell you, huh? He's good. Everything's fine. You know, Sam's the one who spotted you. You guys are taking quite a bit of water. What's wrong with you? Henry! Get back, Sean! Hey! He's pissed, but he's not gonna do anything.
You sure about that?
Stop!
Joel?
He left us to die out there.
No, you had a good chance of making it, and you did. But coming back for you meant putting him at risk. Stay back.
These contradictory character traits, showing someone as a good person and then having them do immoral actions. These traits, justified as character depth, trying to make gray areas out of a black and white subject. And more dangerously, if you try to make sense out of these characters, you would hold two contradicting ideas about morality, holding something that is false and true and being forced to reconcile both without a simple explanation. As if the writer quite simply wrote it that way, and any reflection on a real state of affairs is your own conjecture. And we're supposed to suspend our disbelief to take in such worldviews. Holding these two opposing contradictory ideas at the same time about what to do is at the basis of brainwashing a person into doing the wrong thing, and then justifying it for themselves as a general misanthropic blanket statement like, "It's just human nature," or "I didn't have a choice." A non-invasively, non-programmy way of dealing with such story sequences would be to have the character establish their moral stance and stick to it. If Henry had stuck with the fact that he left them in danger because his priority is his little brother, and this is how hardened he's become, had that been established from the very beginning, then fine. And then he can say, "It's me and my brother, Joel. I would have done it all over again. He's all I have. But you have him to thank for your life. I wouldn't have pulled you out of the water if you hadn't refused to budge until I did." Or something along those lines that would keep him consistent. Instead, we have them form an alliance and then he turns his back on him. And then he goes back again to save him. You can have hardened characters. You can have characters with a soft heart. But you can't interchange these characters whenever you please and fit them in the same personality. A character that would be one way and not be the other. And trying to make sense of this, because it's thrown at you as part of the plot, is very psychologically grating on anyone who is emotionally invested and or susceptible. It gives the illusion that the normal state of being is one where you don't take moral stances and you just stick in the middle and act like a schizoid.
Each other out. And second, they might still look like people, but that person is not in there anymore.
Henry says that they've moved on, that they're with their families, like in heaven. Do you think that's true?
I go back and forth. I mean, I'd like to believe it.
But you don't.
I guess not.
Yeah, me neither.
Oh, all the serious talk. I almost forgot. There. If he doesn't know about it, he can't take it away. All right, I'm pooped. I'll see you tomorrow.
It is in the worst of situations that faith is strongest. If we're to go back to using third world countries as a real world analogy of what it would be like in an apocalyptic future, then you will observe that faith and belief is strongest in these places and in the worst of times. And these are kids talking like modern, grown-ass college graduates about atheism. It just doesn't fit. It feels forced. And it's the kid that says, quote, like heaven, close quote, which implies that he made that leap. His brother just said that they're with their families. Why make that specific critique? And from the mouth of a child, a symbol of innocence, not something that sounds like it could have come from a low-level college philosophy debate. If you've seen episode 1 and 2 of this series, you would know that long times of drudgery followed up by shock is a pattern used in a lot of media. A long time of drudgery and nothing happening followed by shock. It's like the zombies came out of nowhere as the reverse Deus Ex Machina, just so that Druckmann can limit the population back to just Ellie and Joel.
What have you done?
I'm gonna get that gun from you, okay? Oh, okay, easy.
This is your fault.
This is nobody's fault, Henry.
It's all your fault.
Henry! Henry, no!
It's such a sad statement about the character of the writers and how they won't give anyone a heroic moment. No one gets a truly heroic moment in the story. It's always muddled by some form of weakness or irredeemable character flaw. To claim that this is in any way empowering is an insult to the very concept of power. This is a reoccurring theme in these stories, just disheartening demoralization where you are forced to experience an imaginary world where no one is a hero and forcibly swallow this blue pill of quote-unquote this is realistic, as if we're supposed to believe that the heroes of the real world don't exist everywhere around us. Imagine the scene as an alternative. After we see the bite, Sam takes a moment before picking up the toy, looks at it, and starts to cry. But in order to reflect the growth of his character, throughout the previous scenes wherein he was getting braver and more vocal, he finally manages to pull himself together. He steps into the adjacent room and tells his brother the truth. He faces his mortality head on, bravely and with peace. A character arc with the same basic events, but a completely different message. But no, we need a murder-suicide scene out of left field. Why would the kid do something so cowardly that will put the others in danger? It's not fair to the characters, and it's not fair to the viewers. This is just like what happens in Uncharted 4 and Life is Strange, where no one is a hero. It's always like this with these stories, where you have to pick one of two evils, which is why I greatly respect the character of Geralt of Rivia, despite how bland he may be. He doesn't appreciate that kind of sentiment.
That's certain. Evil is evil. Lesser, greater, middling, makes no difference.
Come fit me.
Bring her down. Do it my way. You like that, you bitch? Get the hammer. Kick her teeth in.
The degree is arbitrary. The definition's blurred. If I'm to choose between one evil and another, I'd rather not choose at all.
You're a fucking animal.
It's awfully quick to judgment. Considering you and your friend killed how many men?
They didn't give us a choice.
And you think we have a choice? Is that it? You kill to survive. And so do we.
You think we had a choice? Well, you can't say no to the boss when Neil Druckmann says, we kill, we kill. You don't understand, little girl. You have to kill to survive. Leaning on a cheap pop culture version of Darwinistic behaviorism to explain the gaping plot hole of why are they just pointing and shooting at people without even asking questions, without knowing who it is. Everybody loves Ellie. Ellie is hands down the best female action heroine in any media ever, despite what the sequel may suggest, which will need a whole other video to talk about. Her depiction as a female lead in The Last of Us 1 is so cathartic, which is something you want from an action hero. Especially that she makes sense. There's no expense spared when it comes to putting her at a disadvantage. She is depicted as physically weaker. You have to account for that in the combat, and it is amazing. It's doubly satisfying when you bring someone down as Ellie. Her character is also very fun. It's very comforting to see a strong female lead being put at a believable disadvantage and still survive against all odds. The way she maintains her grit and sass restores your faith in humanity. And that's why it is so sad and disappointing when she loses this by the end of the game. But we'll get back to that. It is very important to show someone going through trauma, but only if you show them come out of the other side. And if they lose a part of themselves in the process, it doesn't count as a recovery. In this game, she never goes back to being a happy, strong kid in the end. And by the looks of it, she gets even more pessimistic and depressed in the sequel. What made her awesome is never recovered, which means that the bad guys won. It's such a shame, because she's no longer the coolest character. She's just a political statement. It's almost like they tricked us into liking her, just so that we get invested enough to swallow this political agenda. She's been presented as someone who's already gone through a lot of pain. She already lost a lot of people, including her best friend or romantic interest, and yet she was still jolly and full of willpower. But that all seems to have been thrown out the window conveniently for that chapter. It feels like Druckmann forgot the character he wrote himself. Maybe purposefully so. Throughout the game, you get the impression that Ellie would have been the life of the party, and would have risen above this and shrugged it off like it was nothing. Maybe a bit of shock, sure, but still full of confidence, and years later, she still hasn't recovered. As the player, you feel cheated. Druckmann completely changed her personality for nothing. The villain, David, has already came onto her, showing his pedophilic side. She broke his finger. What's the big deal? Is seeing a body being chopped up supposed to break her? Cannibalism wouldn't be that much of a shock to her, because she's already seen the infected eat people all the time. It's not as much of a contrast compared to what she sees on a daily basis. And she did get her revenge and her justice. But Druckmann still forces a point here that breaks the character's development arc. And you need to be aware of that if you are deriving any semblance of a life lesson from the story sequence.
Stop! Stop!
Fucking touch me!
It's okay. It's me. It's me. It's me. Look. It's me.
He tried to...
Oh, baby girl. It's okay. It's okay.
No.
It's okay.
In the story of Ish, after reading the letters left behind, Joel says, "That wasn't a good idea, was it?" And he's referring to making the colony in the sewers, which was the safe house that eventually became a thriving community, where they had a school, makeshift beds, shower stalls, and even rain catchers. It was humanity thriving even in the most dire of situations. And then you have Joel saying that wasn't a good idea, was it, after reading the letters? What exactly is a good idea in this story? It seems like the only way to survive in Neil Druckmann's world is to become a degenerate. Even Joel is a thief who's admittedly killed innocent people. He says that he pulled ambush tactics on people, the same way the gang in Pittsburgh did.
Wait! Let me go. Please.
You just come after her.
Making Marlene out to be good and Joel out to be bad in the end. Sacrificing one life for the greater good is pure horseshit. So why would someone do this? Is it that they're part of some
secret agenda?
Or is this second or even third-hand cynicism and misanthropy? The product of a lazy, hostile imagination, maybe? We can only speculate based on aggregated information. But there is one thing that we don't need to speculate about. Whenever somebody says that humanity is bad, whenever they're pessimistic about the people of the world, it doesn't say something about you or the population. It says something about them, what they've done, what they've compromised in their life, and what they're struggling with in their character. And sometimes being the bad guy feels lonely, so it's more comfortable to pretend that everyone else is too. Some part of me feels that maybe Neil Druckmann is trying to make a game so violent, so cruel, so viscerally disgusting to go through that people would just drop the controller and say fuck it, it's not worth it, and not continue the game as a kind of subconscious mass psychology test. Maybe, on some level, he wants us to not play the game. Maybe he expects us to not want to kill dogs or succumb to the cycle of cruelty and revenge. Maybe he expects the best of us, which is why he makes it a focus in his design process to not think of his games as fun. Or maybe, just maybe, he's trying to recruit that 10%.